Hello and welcome to Where the Wind Blows, Offshore Wind Outlook for State Regulators. I am your tech host, Dom Liberator, Logistics and Finance Officer for CPI. We're going to get started here, but first I did see that we had a lot of new faces or new attendees on this webinar, so I'm going to run through just the basic of what is NARUC and what CPI is all about. So to get us started, what is NARUC? We're a nonprofit organization founded in 1889. Our members are all the state regulatory commissioners in all 50 states and territories. FERC and SSC commissioners are also members, and NARUC has associate members in over 20 countries. We regulate member agencies. Our member agencies regulate electricity, natural gas, telecom, and water utilities. And secondly, what is NARUC Center for Partnerships and Innovation? We are a grant-funded team dedicated to providing technical assistance to our members. We identify emerging challenges and connect state commissions with expertise and strategies. We also build relationships, develop resources, and deliver trainings. We have a great new website that you all should check out, www.naruc.org/CPI, which will take you to our front page. We have 4 topical areas and a bunch of good resources that you all should make use of. So just before I hand it over to our moderator, I just wanted to go over some webinar logistics. So just to let you know, we are recording the webinar and it will be posted in their webpage that I just mentioned. Because of how many people are on, I think we have about 150 today. We are in listen only mode, but we do want you guys to contribute and use the questions box at any time and direct your question to a specific panelist, and those questions will be ends at the Q&A session at the end we'll have 10 minutes for that. All right, so now I will hand it off to David Littell. David brings more than 25 years of regulatory experience to RAP. He provides advice to state officials, public utility commissions, and environmental regulators on complex energy pollution and economic issues. Prior to RAP, Mr. Littell served as commissioner of the Maine Public Utilities Commission from 2010 to 2015. He is very well versed in this topic and will be a great moderator to sort of guide our conversation. So David, please take it away.
Thank you, Dominic, and thank you to NARUC and your hardworking staff. Gary Worthington's on too, for organizing this today. And I also want to note that NARUC itself had its meeting just a week ago and passed a resolution on offshore wind transmission that recognized the importance of working in this area on offshore grid issues. That resolution, in short, passed by the board just a few days ago. Recognize that in this area we have a lot of improvements to do, that a lot of activity is occurring. That's what we're here to talk about today. It's a very, very timely issue. The resolution urged both the FERC and the RTOs on the East Coast to open up and look at the transmission issues according to open access principles, and recognize that there may be some real reliability benefits, some operational and cost-saving benefits to incorporating the significant amount of offshore wind generation that we have right now coming online. And there may be also environmental benefits by reducing the environmental impact by as much as half for building out this grid. And lastly, that they're very important competitive and cost-saving measures, and that the opportunity should be open both to traditional utility type approaches and also to non-traditional competitive merchant approaches. So wanted to thank and recognize the NARUC board and leadership on the ERE committee, including Chairman Stanek, who is on this call. Maryland played an important part. The chairman of the Colorado Commission, Jeff Ackerman, and chair of the North Carolina Commission, Charlotte Mitchell, as well as Commissioner Abigail Anthony from Rhode Island, all played critical roles in that resolution and its consideration. And also to note that less than a month ago, FERC held its technical conference in this area, looking at some of the very issues that we'll be talking about and examining today, how we should move forward with offshore offshore wind development and offshore grid development and how we should integrate that into the grid. And then just yesterday, the New Jersey Board of Public Utilities announced that they've asked PJM to look into these same issues too. So very timely set of issues. Stepping back a second just to observe for those that don't work in this area regularly, that the 6 states on the East Coast have adopted as targets over 28 gigawatts of offshore wind to be procured. Already 6 gigawatts of that is under contract to be developed. We have Orsted, who is the largest player and acquirer of these contracts right now on this panel today, so we're fortunate to have them. But that's a lot of capacity. That is just short of, it's not quite the entire capacity we have for the 6 New England states, for example. And some observers believe it will get up in more in the range of 40 gigawatts. So anywhere, we're talking about a lot of capacity, a lot of offshore wind to be integrated over the next decade or so into our grid. So with that, I am going to introduce 3 very expert panelists who we have with us today. First is Joe Martens. I had the pleasure of working with Joe on the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative Board when he was the Environmental Commissioner for New York from 2011 through 2015. Joe is currently the director of the New York Offshore Wind Alliance and previously was a fellow and president of the Open Space Institute and has held a variety of other significant policy positions, including in the first Cuomo administration in New York, Mario Cuomo's administration, and has done an awful lot in this area. Our second panelist is Chairman Jason Stanek, Chairman of the Maryland Commission. As I noted on this issue, but also in general, Chairman Stanek has emerged as one of the leading chairmen and commissioners nationally on issues. I was struck by how many states look to him for guidance on where Maryland stands on these issues when the NARUC discussions occurred on this resolution. Before being named as the chairman of the Maryland Commission by Governor Hogan, he served as senior counsel to the Energy Subcommittee of the U.S. House of Representatives Committee on Energy and Commerce. And before that, he was a long-term senior staffer with the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, where he advised both FERC chairmen and commissioners. And most people know him as one of the FERC specialists from DC. And even before that, he worked for natural gas companies in New York and for the CFTC, the Commodity Futures Trading Commission, which regulates gas. And we have Fred Zalcman, who's Orsted's head of government affairs in the U.S. In that capacity, he works on developing sustainable markets for offshore energy and has a long-term 30-year history of working on market structures and development for energy efficiency and renewable developments, including before that as the East Coast Director for SunEdison in the U.S. So with that, I look forward to hearing from each of our panelists and then from the questions and discussions we have with all of you. So thank you for joining us. Joe, to you.
David, thank you for that introduction, and thank you, NARUC, for inviting me to fill in for Andrew Goen from WEA, who was unfortunately had some medical issues that he had to attend to and wasn't able to attend. So I'm probably not going to be able to give you as broad a view as Andrew would give you about the status of offshore wind in the U.S., but I'm to give you a flavor of how it's developed and where we are in New York State. And I think a lot of what's happened in New York State has been a relatively common experience to states up and down the East Coast. So hopefully it'll all be relevant. Just a quick advertisement about the subject of East New York, which is the Alliance for Clean Energy. And it was started about 4 years ago or so to focus solely on promoting the responsible development of offshore wind off of New York's coastline. And as you can see from the first slide here, we have a wide and diverse variety of members from offshore wind developers like Orsted, Equinor, RWE, and many others, to national and local environmental organizations like the Sierra Club, NRDC, and the like. We also have New York State's major labor unions. So we make a very strong coalition, and sometimes odd bedfellows, but we are all pushing for the responsible development of offshore wind. The second slide, please. So why is New York and many states? And what slide I like to start off with in just about every presentation, whether it's on offshore wind, renewable, just about anything. This is, many of you are probably familiar with it. It's called the Keeling curve. It was basically a measurement of CO2 concentrations around the globe starting since 1958. And how many times have you heard that in the coronavirus situation that we should flatten the curve? Well, that's what we need to do with the Keeling curve as well. As you can see, since the 1950s to the present, there has been a long and steady and remarkably consistent rise in CO2 levels as measured at the Mauna Loa Observatory in Hawaii. And we need to flatten that curve. Next slide, please. So we have seen a remarkable rise in offshore wind, not only in New York State, but in the US. Just in the last 5 years, I can tell you that when I was DEC commissioner from 2010 to 2015, there was barely any mention of offshore wind. It was just not a focus. Frankly, we were focused on other things like dealing with the natural gas situation in New York. But starting in about 2016, New York State really took off in earnest in pursuit of an offshore wind agenda. And you're looking at the Block Island Wind Farm, the first commercial wind farm in the US. 5 6 megawatt turbines. It's owned and operated by Orsted. And it was a relatively unique situation. It really came out of the ashes of a project that was proposed off of Cape Cod. Many of you, I'm sure, have heard of it, the Cape Wind Project, which after 10 years of trying was finally it fell apart after 10 years. And Block Island literally grew out of those ashes, and it is the first offshore wind farm in the US. Next slide. So I noticed that several of my colleagues on the panel have a similar slide to this, so I won't take too much time on it, but here's the reasons why we're pursuing offshore wind. We have some of the best wind resources, as seen by the heat map on the middle panel, in the world. It's near load centers. Think of Boston, New York, Philadelphia, New Jersey, Long Island. We have a serious transmission problem in New York in getting renewables that are developed in upstate New York in, and this would relieve those bottlenecks because we'd be injecting the offshore wind directly into load centers in the downstate region. It's easier to cite, and I put a couple of question marks there because we still, other than the Block Island Wind Farm, we have yet to get to a complete siting other than the pilot project off of Virginia, which was recently approved, which is 2 turbines. We have a shallow outer continental, right? So we can use conventional foundations to support the turbines. And we are looking at retiring peaking plants in New York and the retirement of 2 nuclear power plants just north of New York City, which total about 2,000 megawatts in capacity. And then finally, costs are dropping dramatically, about a 50% drop in offshore wind costs just in the last 5 years or so. And then what I neglected to put on this slide is maybe the 2 most important reasons, and I've already mentioned one of them, which is the enormous environmental and economic benefits that offshore wind brings. Thousands of jobs, it will reduce our CO2 emissions, and it will also reduce conventional pollutants like particulates and nitrogen oxide. Next slide, please. So, as I mentioned earlier, we have very far, very fast in New York State. Governor called for a master plan in 2016. In 2017, he announced a 2,400 megawatt goal for the state, and he urged the Long Island Power Authority to sign a contract with, at the time, Deepwater Wind for a 90 megawatt project that would supply power to the South Fork of Long Island. That contract was approved later that year, and that project has grown from 90 megawatts to 130 megawatts thanks to the increase in size of the turbines. In 2018, the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority released a extraordinarily comprehensive master plan, which was really a roadmap on how we get to the 2,400 megawatts that the governor called for. 2019, we got the first bids from the state's first solicitation. We got 4 bids, different potential projects ranging in size from 14 to, I believe, 1,200 megawatts. And then in 2019, the governor and the legislature got together and signed what is arguably the most aggressive climate announcement. When he signed the law, he announced the 2 contracts from the first offshore wind solicitations, totaling about 1,700 megawatts. So 2019 was a really busy year for New York. And things haven't slowed down a bit in 2020, despite the pandemic. We have a new renewable energy siting law that was approved last April, which primarily applies to siting onshore renewables, but it was a clear acknowledgement that if New York was going to reach its climate goals, it had to accelerate the process dramatically for siting large-scale onshore renewable projects. And it also addressed a couple of key points for offshore wind. It accelerated the siting process for transmission connections to from offshore to onshore, and excuse me, and it also called for a transmission study. It mentioned how important transmission is earlier in his introduction, and New York is looking comprehensively at both onshore and offshore transmission, and we hope to have the results of that study later this year. And then finally, just a few weeks ago, the Public Service Commission approved what we call the 70 by 30 order, which was an amendment to the state's clean energy standard. And next slide, please. It was a comprehensive order that basically told us how we're electricity by 2030, which is one of the provisions in the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, along with a 9,000 megawatt offshore wind standard by 2035. The rest of the provisions as they apply to generating facilities is in this slide. I won't go into them in detail now. So extremely busy in New York. Next slide, please. So I already covered this because I'm trying to keep within my time frame. We, on the heels of that climate law, the siting law was passed. The PSC passed its order, the 70 by 30 order, which again is a complete roadmap on how we get to 70% renewable energy by 2030. Next slide, please. I mentioned several times that New York is not alone in its ambitions. Although we do have the largest offshore wind target that's now inscribed in law, many other states have extraordinarily ambitious goals or standards as well. And these total up to about 2,800 megawatts of demand. Many of these goals have already seen contracts executed, like in New York, where we have about 1,800 megawatts under contract. Next slide, please. So just some quick highlights from New York's offshore wind approach. As I mentioned, the first solicitation went out in 2018, and the bids were awarded in 2019. The state took obviously a aggressive approach on price. 70% of those bids are weighted towards price. 20% viability. Now, the 20% economic benefits came in various forms in those bids, from commitments to investments in ports, to commitments to train the labor community, and also investments in local projects, but mostly surrounding port development. It also included some really important provisions for labor. It requires prevailing wage to be paid and requires developers to negotiate project labor agreements as part of their projects. And importantly, it also required environmental and fisheries mitigation plans. One of the biggest challenges is sure that it is done compatibly with other users in the ocean space, and the commercial fishing industry is one of those very important other stakeholders. So the requirement for environmental and fisheries mitigation plans was huge. The solicitation also required stakeholder outreach and a plan for that. And then finally, it established what we refer to in New York as the TWIGs, the technical working groups, one for the environment, one for fisheries, one for the maritime issues, and one for jobs and supply, jobs and supply chain development. So the second solicitation went out this year and asked for bids of up to 2,500 megawatts. Those bids are now in. The interesting twist in this year's solicitation was NYSERDA, the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority, married the bids for offshore wind projects a port development component. So bidders had to identify where they would invest in ports, up to $200 million in ports, in any of 11 pre-qualified ports from Long Island to Albany. Next, successful bidders also had to commit to a 10,000 megawatt fee for regional wildlife and fisheries research effort. And the hope was that other states would follow suit. And as you could see, if a successful bidder did have a 2,500 megawatt project, that could be $25 million down payment on a regional.
Hey, Joe, looks like we lost you for a second. I'm going to take you off webcam just because I think it's slowing you down.
Well, I'll just keep launching ahead. I don't see the next slide yet, but.
There you are.
Okay, thank you. So I mentioned the 70 by 30 order that the PSC recently authorized, and significantly, it also was a clear indication that we are on a fast track in New York to get offshore wind contracts, solicitations and contracts settled as quickly as possible. The PSC gave the NYSERDA the authority to issue all its future offshore wind solicitations without going back to the PSC for approval. It acknowledged that it will take about a solicitation per year from 2022 through 2027 of 750 to 1,000 megawatts per year in order to meet our 70 by 30 target. And it also called on NYSERDA to do a feasibility study for offshore wind in the Great Lakes. So all very aggressive steps again, and the winners of the second solicitation will be selected soon, we hope by the end of the year. And if it's a 2,500 megawatt winner, or several winners that totals 2,500 megawatts, New York will be nearly halfway to reaching the 9,000 megawatt statutory standard by 2035. So a lot of ifs there, and these projects need to get built, importantly, and I'd be happy to talk about some of those challenges, but I know some of the other speakers are going to cover those, and be happy to take questions at the end. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Chair Stanek.
Thank you, and good afternoon. Well, today we're talking about the outlook for offshore wind, and I think we need to be cognizant of the political winds, both the tailwinds and the headwinds. You can take a look at the Biden victory as an apparent win for environmentalists and offshore wind, but at the same time, we need to recognize that what's going to happen in Washington will have an effect over the next 4 years. 1 week before Election Day, we saw our federal regulator host a conference on offshore wind and how to improve the transmission development of that. And then the day after Election Day, we saw that the president fired the nation's top energy regulator. Additionally, just yesterday, 2 of Trump's nominees for vacant FERC seats were approved out of committee, and it's likely that Majority Leader Mitch McConnell will schedule those 2 vacancies for a vote later on in December. So President Biden, although he will have some pretty aggressive environmental and renewable initiatives, will have a federal regulator with 5 Trump appointees. So that's just a backdrop we need to be aware of post-election. There we go. Thank you, Dom. So here we are, we're taking a look at offshore wind potential in the Mid-Atlantic, specifically focused on the Mid-Atlantic. All the colored spots are areas of high quality wind that can be developed. If all of those leaseholds are developed, and I would say that approximately, if you look at the purple area, between 39 and 49 gigawatts of potential power would be generated by this offshore wind system. That would be approximately 30% of the entire capacity for New York, New England, and the PJM region. So it's not an insubstantial amount of capacity that we're dealing with. And of the 6 gigawatts that's currently in production in the pipeline, we know that they're already leasing the project areas. They're beginning site assessments. At the very bottom left-hand corner, you see the Skipjack and U.S. wind projects that are currently approved by the Maryland Public Service Commission and under development. Next slide, please. We've seen this chart once before. This is just overall Mid-Atlantic capacity commitments by states. You see that New York and New Jersey have very aggressive goals with 9,000 and 7,500 megawatts respectively. Maryland is a little further behind. We currently have 1,200 megawatts out for bid in 3 capacity tranches of 400 megawatts each. But if you take a look on the left side, this commitment represents a $120 billion investment by Mid-Atlantic states over the next 15 or so years. Next slide, please. Maryland is well positioned as a leader in offshore wind. We passed our first legislation to incentivize offshore wind back in the year 2012. This site that you're taking a look of is just south of Baltimore. It's called the Trade Point Atlantic site. It has a deep water port at the north part of the Chesapeake Bay, where ocean-going vessels could make deliveries of turbine blades and turbine supports. Orsted has already leased 50 acres of this very large facility, which is the home to a former steel mill, Bethlehem Steel, which was there for many years. So there's obviously a lot of economic development. 3 states just signed an MOU last month to work together to encourage increased offshore wind economic development, that being Maryland, Virginia, and North Carolina. Next slide, please. So this is just a high-level overview of the regulatory framework that's involved in the approval and permitting of offshore wind. As a quick primer, you have FERC, whose jurisdiction comes from the Federal Power Act. They regulate interstate wholesale sales of transmission. You also have BOEM, the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management. It's a bureau within the Department of Interior, and they control the leases and some of the environmental NEPA reviews. State governments like New York and Maryland, their PSCs have varying authorities. In Maryland, we have the authority to approve ORECs, these offshore renewable energy credits, which are funded by ratepayers, and it serves as an incentive to develop some of these new renewable projects. The state in 2017 has already offered these ORECs to both US Wind and to Orsted to develop their projects. And then at the local level, you have both interconnection, siting, and party status in federal and state cases. We're very mindful of the local communities because that's where these wind turbines will be sited off of their coastlines. Next slide, please. We've heard there's 2 different ways to support the development of offshore wind. Maryland, I said we use ORECs, but other states in the Northeast use more of a contract-based approach through a power purchase agreement. Here we have the ORECs in Maryland and New Jersey, but you see that the contractual PPA approach is used in some of the New England states and New York. I should also note that in Virginia, they're working on a different approach. They have a number of turbines actually spinning, and they're working with their local vertically integrated utility, which is Dominion, and they'll be recovering the cost of those projects through base rates paid for by electric customers. Next slide, please. So the project approval process from start to finish has been taking about 10 years in total, and that's probably about 5 years too long. Under the current administration, it's been criticized for not providing enough resources to BOEM. Therefore, the planning, the leasing, the site assessment, everything that goes into receiving the federal approval has slowed down tremendously. And projects are reviewed on a first come, first served basis. So if you have one project that is stalled or is having more problems, projects that follow suit behind that project oftentimes are delayed. This is a photograph of a public comment hearing that we held in Ocean City, Maryland in January, and that citizen there with his sign obviously took a position that he was opposed to offshore wind off of Maryland. It's obviously a very controversial issue for some, but we'll see some photos in a bit that accurately describe what the view impacts of some of these turbines will be. Next slide, please. In Maryland, we've issued 2 rounds of solicitations to encourage offshore wind development. And if you take a look at the horizon, you can actually see what resembles a 12 megawatt wind turbine. This is an actual photograph, although the turbines are just an illustration and representation. So those turbines are approximately 27 miles off of the coast of Ocean City. But under our law that was passed in 2013, we did establish set-asides for offshore wind, and that was a maximum of 2.5% of electricity sold in Maryland in the year 2017. And below on the beach, you see our 2 projects, US Wind and Skipjack. They would both be receiving these ORECs for 20 years. Although for those of you who are FERC watchers and are paying close attention to the MOPR debate, there is a question of whether one of our projects will qualify for capacity payments and another will not. but the MOPR is an issue that is continuing to play out both before FERC and before the federal courts. Next slide, please. This is a representation of the wind turbine technology that would be used by the Orsted project off of the coast of Maryland. And this is the Haliade X 12 megawatt carbon fiber blade turbine technology that they have selected. As you can see, the height rivals that of both the Chrysler Building in New York and the Eiffel Tower. And my final slide is what comes next. We're currently now in round 2 of our solicitation, and that law was passed by Maryland legislators just last year, authorizing another 1,200 megawatts of capacity commitments for offshore wind in our state. That additional 1,200 megawatts would cost Maryland ratepayers approximately a surcharge of 88 cents per month on their bill. It'll be a little more for non-residential customers as well. So we're in the midst of that solicitation for the year 2020, 2021, and 2022. And these are for 6-year forward commitments, meaning that the 2021 certifications won't be in effect until 2026. So hopefully you found that high-level overview of Maryland and the Mid-Atlantic to be helpful. And I will now yield the floor to Frederick Zalcman at Orsted. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Chairman Stanek. Next slide, please. So it's a pleasure to be here with everyone this afternoon to discuss the role that offshore wind can play in our future energy mix. While offshore wind's a mature technology in Europe, it's still really in its infancy here in the U.S., but it really represents a tremendous opportunity for states to achieve their economic development and goals to decarbonize the grid. In my remarks today, I'll identify the opportunities for offshore wind and some of the growing pains that are faced by the industry and the role that state policymakers can play in fostering this new U.S.-based heavy industry. Next slide, please. So just a quick overview on Orsted. As you may gather from the name, Orsted is a Danish company. We're a vertically integrated utility in Denmark serving customer load. We historically have been predominantly based on fossil fuels, but a strategic decision was made some time ago to transform the company to run entirely on green energy. And I'm really happy to report that as of today, 95% of our generation is based on clean generation. Orsted has also become much more of a global company with a growing portfolio of renewable energy assets really across a global footprint. Where we've really made our mark, however, is in offshore wind. We were the first to build an offshore wind farm. By today's standards, the very tiny 5 megawatt Vindeby project off the coast of Denmark. But today we are responsible for 30% of all offshore wind built to date. The largest wind farm off the coast of the UK, the Hornsea project. And as has been previously noted, we are also the developer of the US's first wind farm, the Block Island wind farm off the coast of Rhode Island, as well as responsible for the second project in the U.S., the Coastal Virginia Offshore Wind Project, where we served in an EPC role to Dominion, and we recently just turned over the keys to that wind farm to that utility. Next slide, please. So Orsted's assembled a strategic portfolio of federal lease areas from which we hope to serve multiple markets across the eastern seaboard. Orsted's really been fortunate. We've been entrusted by the states of Rhode Island, Connecticut, New York, New Jersey, and as the chairman mentioned, Maryland, all to build those states' first offshore wind farms. We have a lot more potential within our lease area, and we believe we can build an additional 8 to 10 gigawatts of capacity to serve these markets. Next slide. So you've seen this slide before. I'm not going to belabor this. I think we're all singing from the same hymnal. Maybe just to provide a little bit of a developer perspective on this, really these physical and demographic attributes, really what they do is they all conspire to allow developers to offer offshore wind at a very low levelized price of electricity. These world-class wind resources blowing up the eastern seaboard. What that translates into, it really allows developers to produce more megawatt hours of generation across the billions of dollars of invested capital in projects and lower the unit price of electricity to the ultimate consumer. In Europe, offshore wind is already cost competitive with renewable generation and conventional sources of generation, and we believe we can quickly get there as well in the U.S. Next slide, please. All right, this has also been previously covered. Again, a great opportunity in the U.S. In addition to the sort of the physical and demographic attributes, really what's driving the U.S. market is public policy. It's very much a policy-driven market, and the states have collectively really stepped up with 28 gigawatts of offshore wind goals by the year 2035. What that means is that it attracts major European experienced offshore wind developers like Orsted. We were certainly the first mover in the U.S. market, but we have a lot of companies these days, and I think that only redounds to the benefit of ratepayers as competition intensifies. Next slide, please.
Unfortunately, it looks like we have lost connection with Frederick. I will try to get him back online, but I think we can.
Hey, why don't?
Okay, there you are.
Yeah, I'm.
Go ahead, Frederick.
Yeah, Dominic, I'm actually on audio as well. So if you can just queue up the slides, I'll proceed.
Great. Yep, we're on your flexible procurement. Yep.
Yep. Okay. Great. So the states have been very active in translating these ambitious targets into steel in the water, as Chairman Stanek and Joe Martens have indicated, and really pleased to say, although each state has its own distinct market mechanism and structure, really the unifying characteristic of these procurements is that they provide long-term financeable offtake, and that's really central to eliciting the capital required to develop these massive generation projects. Additionally, we've really been encouraged by the willingness of states to procure at scale. Again, given the capital-intensive nature of these resources, and the significant economies of scale that we believe can still be exploited, larger projects can produce the lowest levelized cost of energy, and that's beneficial to ratepayers. We've also seen improvements in the procurement processes over time. Regulators are providing developers clearer guidance on the criteria that they'll be used to evaluate projects. And in short, that just means that, if regulators are more transparent with the developer community about what they want, we can be responsive to those needs. Next slide, please. Okay, what I'd like to do in my remaining time is just highlight some of the key challenges facing the industry in bringing this technology to U.S. shores, and the role that you as state regulators can play in helping to reduce these obstacles. Next slide. So one of the biggest challenges we're facing in the industry is the rather sprawling, lengthy, and cumbersome permitting process, and Chairman Stanek alluded to this. Unlike the European market, which is really characterized more by a sort of one-stop permitting regime, in the U.S., permitting encompasses over 20 separate state, federal, and local authorities. Now, while it's impossible to replace the U.S. permitting structure with a more European system, given that it's so deeply embedded in our federalist system of government, there are certainly areas for improvement, and I'll identify a few of those. First, as the lead federal agency, the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management should maintain regular engagement with the states through regional task forces, from lease area identification through project approval, to keep stakeholders engaged throughout the process. This would allow greater congruency between state procurement targets and federal leasing activities. Simply put, we are, although there is probably 40 gigawatts of potential embedded in the existing lease areas, currently there is not enough real estate to meet the state's ambitious targets, and we will need BOEM to begin to identify additional wind energy areas to serve state demand. Regional and stakeholder engagement would also allow for the early identification of potential economic, environmental, cultural, and visual impacts that really transcend state borders and parochial state interests. Secondly, one of the defining features of offshore wind farm development is its complexity and long period of development and construction, developing a decade or more. A design envelope approach to permitting would recognize the significant technological advances that can be realized over the course of project development and allow for flexibility in incorporating new technology to improve the economics and environmental outcomes of a project. While BOEM has issued guidance allowing developers to use a design envelope approach, this approach is not uniformly practiced across all agencies. And last but not least, agency timelines for permit application review, really, especially at the federal level, aren't regularly adhered to. This can significantly impact overall project schedules and the ability of developers to meet their power delivery commitments to the states and to utilities. As Chairman Stanek mentioned, there's currently a significant and growing backlog of projects in the federal permitting queue, and we've been encouraging the Biden administration, incoming Biden administration, and Congress to devote additional resources to clearing the permitting queue. Next slide. Okay, I'd like to turn now to a second challenge, and that's bringing the power to shore. On the U.S. East Coast, transitioning to the land-based grid really has proven to be one of the most challenging aspects of project developing. It's the same sort of challenges that large energy infrastructure projects experience: high population density, high real estate costs, difficulty in finding suitable sites for transition and cable routing, not to mention NIMBY concerns. Additionally, and perhaps more uniquely to offshore wind, the power grid was really not designed to take large amount of power from offshore. Many coastal communities are served by lower voltage lines, and really there are few suitable points of interconnection to bring the large generation capacity from offshore wind to shore. Much of the attention to date has been focused on the offshore grid, but significant investment in the onshore grid will be needed as well to accommodate this new energy resource. Next slide. So we believe, the next dozen or so large offshore wind farms will be connected via radial transmission lines. But as the states increase the amount of power they want from offshore resources, and as the onshore points of interconnection become more scarce, we're going to need to consider more transmission options. A backbone transmission system could make interconnecting offshore wind a little easier, especially in high-density urban areas like New York City. But if we do go forward with a backbone system, it needs to be done right. Orsted has a lot of experience in this area from Europe, and for a backbone system to be successful, it really needs to have three fundamental elements. First, a solid revenue and risk allocation mechanism. Now, we don't normally provide this for traditional onshore power plants, but because the maintenance and repair costs of offshore buried cable is so much more than onshore transmission, and the potential for extended outages and attendant revenue loss so much greater, it's really necessary. As developers, we're willing to generally assume the risk when we're responsible for developing the transmission system, but not when we're reliant on a third party for that service. Secondly, state and federal permitting authorities need to make sure that future backbone transmission systems are planned with an eye towards where future lease areas will be, and that they don't favor some lease areas over others. And lastly, FERC should engage the industry and develop clear interconnection standards. This will avoid costly interface issues and allow the developers to size and price their bids to interconnect to a backbone system rather than to an onshore point. Now, tools exist that the states can and should employ to plan and pay for these needed grid upgrades. As David noted in his introductions, one of these is the FERC Order 1000, which allows for for cost sharing for transmission projects that meet public policy goals. And as noted, just yesterday, the New Jersey Board of Public Utilities invoked the state authority approach under the PJM tariff, asking PJM to consider offshore wind targets in PJM's planning process and to conduct a competitive solicitation for offshore and onshore transmission to meet New Jersey's targets. I would note that New York is similarly looking at this rule in the offshore wind context, and we expect that other states will follow suit. So I think I'll wrap up there, leave a little bit of time for Q&A. Hope this has been helpful, and Orsted certainly a willing partner with the states as we solve the remaining challenges facing the industry and bringing the tremendous economic development and environmental potential to fruition. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Frederick. That was excellent. And thank you, Chairman Stanek and Commissioner Martens. We have a number of questions in. Hopefully we'll be able to answer 2 or 3 of them. And I think, Frederick, you just foreshadowed one, but it's directed towards Joe Martens. Feel free to turn on your cameras if your bandwidth can sustain it. Joe, is there sufficient lease area already available in the New York Bight by BOEM, or additional lease areas going to be made, going to be necessary to satisfy New York's needs, not to mention the needs of New Jersey and other states? Do you have any view on that?
Absolutely. Thanks for the question. So the existing lease areas are adequate to get us through they've gotten us through the first solicitation. They'll get us through the second solicitation, so we can handle the additional potential of additional 2,500 megawatts. But beyond that, we will be fairly desperate for new wind energy areas between us and New Jersey, because as you noted earlier, New Jersey's goal is 7,000 megawatts. So there's no question that we'll need new designations, and BOEM has proposed draft primary, what they've called primary and secondary areas. That process has been delayed, and we are hoping that it's resumed shortly, and that in 2021 we will have new wind energy areas and the lease auctions underway.
Okay. Do you have any comment on that? I'll go to you, Frederick. Chairman Stanek, you tend to share some of the southern New Jersey area sites with you in Maryland. Do you have any view on the adequacy of the BOEM areas off of Maryland and New Jersey?
Well, there's still some available lease space in our northern section of the lease areas. Although with New Jersey going to 7,500 megawatt commitment, they'll be using some of that off of their coastline. But I can't get into specifics of how much is remaining.
Thanks, Frederick.
Yeah, and I would just say I would agree with Joe in terms of the supply-demand balance, but I would suggest that it's the goal should not simply be to arrive at an equilibrium point. I think the states really want to encourage competition among developers. So Orsted is in a good position with 4 wind energy areas, but I think the states will want to see multiple parties competing in their solicitation for offshore wind, help drive down the cost of electricity.
Yeah, no, it's amazing how far the costs have come down in Europe with competition, far lower than any analyst predicted. So we'll look for the same thing here. Okay, we have another. We've got 2 questions queued up. So one I can easily answer at the end, so I'll ask you all the harder one. How does the cost of offshore wind compare to the cost of onshore wind and solar? And is that an apples and orange things, or are they comparable?
I think there's no question there's a premium at this point in the nascent development of offshore wind in the United States, that there will be a premium. And as our OREC policy has developed, we recognize that ratepayers in the state will be paying a surcharge every month. But I suspect that once we have some level of economy of scales, particularly in the Northeast, that costs will come down and be more on par with onshore solar.
Yeah, and I would agree with that as well. We are very much in an embryonic stage here in the U.S. And as the supply chain builds out, we will definitely see those costs coming down. I'd also note that offshore wind has very different characteristics. I would say complementary characteristics to solar and onshore wind. We have capacity factors in excess of 50%. And so as we move to decarbonize the grid, offshore wind provides just a nice complement to solar when the sun's not shining.
Yeah, absolutely. They tend to generate at different times when the energy is needed. Okay, thank you. The last question, I'll just I'll pose it and then I'm happy to jump in and answer it. But someone's asking about, this is primarily an East Coast panel, but they're asking if there are any comments on the potential for wind off of the West Coast of the United States. Any takers? Okay.
Yes.
Joe said yes. Yeah, the characteristics tend to be a little bit different. There's more deep water off of the West Coast, like my state of Maine, which has wind power goals, but has to be satisfied with deep water wind largely rather than shallow wind. So a little bit more challenging, a little bit more technology development at this point. But certainly possible, and there are companies that are experimenting with that off of Scotland and off of Japan as well. So with that, to keep us on schedule, let's see if we state and federal rules. I think we're 2 minutes over. So unless Dominic gives me license to continue, I am going to thank each of you. This was an excellent panel. You covered things in great detail, and as I said, it's a very hot, timely issue, and we look forward to working with you and with NARUC. The NARUC commissioners are the ones who make a lot of the decisions here, so it's a critical area. I used to say on the environmental side, the utility commissioners teed up, made all the important decisions on paying for things, and then we got to permit it when it got to the environmental side. So it's an important group. So thank you to NARUC for sponsoring this and for putting this forward. And thank you, Chairman Stanek, Commissioner Martens, Fred. It's a pleasure to be on the panel with you. Dominic, do you have any final wrap-up comments?
Yeah, thank you all for taking the time to be part of this. I wish we could keep going, but yes, we are out of time. I got the slide up here for our next webinar. So on December 3rd, it's every third Thursday. So one Thursday each month from 3 to 4. Our webinar on December 3rd will be how corporate renewable energy procurement can fuel decarbonation, if only we let it. And that is coming up soon. So definitely sign up for that. We need some sign-ups there. And then we have another one in January 2021. I can't believe we're putting stuff on the calendar for 2021 already. With that, I will thank you all, speakers, panelists, and we will catch you next time. Thanks a lot.
Thank you for joining us.
Thanks.
Thank you.